Let's get to this first one that comes from Kelsey. So Kelsey, thank you for submitting. It is, I have come, and I love this question, by the way, Patrick, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this one. We might even spend the rest of the time talking about this concept. But it's Kelsey says, I've come across more and more research on the physiological sigh as an immediate stress reducer. Thoughts on the physiological sigh versus not/mitigating the desire to sigh that Patrick has mentioned in the oxygen advantage. So the first thing that we'll probably do here, Patrick, is we might need to clarify some terminology because I just don't want us to kind of go throughout and talk about these concepts without like opening up kind of maybe what Kelsey's referring to. When she's talking about and referring to the physiological sigh, and we can put that in quotes, this is actually a term that was coined by Dr. Andrew Huberman. And if people aren't listening to Andrew Huberman's podcast, Huberman Lab, they should. It's incredible. He's a phenomenal neuroscientist. People who have listened to kind of me talk know that I have a bit of a man crush on Andrew Huberman because I really just enjoy his content. But he's talked about kind of this role of actually conscientiously, almost like reenacting a sigh as a breathwork practice. So when we talk about a sigh, and we'll open up the physiology of a true physiological sigh, this type of practice is conscientiously sighing. So what does that look like? Well, he terms it as, and this is what has been found in the literature, as an inhale through the nose, a pause, a brief pause, then another inhale, small, short inhale, and then an exhale. So for people watching on YouTube, or if you can hear it on the podcast, I'll now perform a physiological sigh. So it's an inhale, pause, another short inhale, and then exhale. So that is the practice that we're referring to. Now, what we should also then clarify too is like, what is an actual sigh that occurs? Like, what is the purpose of a sigh? Why is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And if physiological sighs that are not like a conscientious practice, if they're a bad thing, then why would we do kind of this practice that is supposedly a good thing? So I'm going to pause now, and Patrick, maybe I'll let you take this one. Can we just talk about the role of an unconscientious sigh, and why we do that, and what the purpose of it is, and is it a bad thing, good thing, neutral thing? I'll let you take that one.
I think it's a great question. So the definition of a sigh per se is when the volume of air that you breathe is 3 times normal. So normal tidal volume during rest is 500 mil. And a sigh is when you are breathing 3 times that volume during one breath. And we're talking about rest here. I always remember, when people coming in and they sigh a lot, it tells me that their breathing is not ideal. So frequent sighing is very much associated with people with anxiety, panic disorder, but people also when they are feeling uncomfortable. And then the question we have to ask is, when is a sigh not good? And how do you define this? And this is the real question. I don't think anybody has the answer for. As far as I know, Dr. Andrew Huberman, he talks about we sigh naturally once every 5 minutes. I'm not so sure. If I'm talking to a group of 20 or 30 people, and normally I'm pretty good at picking up on people's breathing patterns, especially when they sigh, because a sigh is pretty evident. I don't see this happening in everyday life. So I don't always see it happening so frequently. Now, then we have to ask the question, well, if you're sighing once every minute, is that bad? 2 minutes, is that bad? 3 minutes, is that bad? 4 minutes, in other words, where's the cutoff point? It is normal to sigh at different times throughout the day, and that's very, very normal. Why do people with dysfunctional breathing sigh more frequently? And for part, I would say it's down to alleviating the feeling of air hunger. That they can have such a strong chemosensitivity to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, they're feeling a little bit of air hunger, and they unconsciously take that full big breath to get rid of more carbon dioxide from the blood through the lungs, and this gets rid of their feeling of air hunger. Now, the large full big breath that they're taking is also likely to stimulate the vagus nerve via the movement of the diaphragm. And also, it's almost that there's a stretch happening. You're stretching everything and then you're relaxing it. So there's probably a number of things happening. But the only problem is, If somebody is frequently sighing, it can keep them stuck in dysfunctional breathing patterns. So maybe we should divide this into an unhealthy sigh and a healthy sigh. And a healthy sigh is normal. That's when it's happening, throughout the day at different times. But how frequently does it occur? I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
An unhealthy sigh is when you're sighing frequently and it's helping to keep your breathing pattern dysfunctional, that you're removing too much carbon dioxide from the blood. I think this raises more questions than it answers. And we do have to bear in mind, anytime that we see somebody sighing frequently, is that really a good sign? And then I would ask the question, would it be a good thing to be doing to be sighing frequently throughout the day? Well, the only thing that could say to me is, could you by doing that, you're getting rid of a lot of carbon dioxide. One sigh can remove between 7 and 16 millimeters of carbon dioxide from the lungs and hence reduce it in the blood, even though it takes a little bit more time in the blood. But if you were sighing frequently, could it instigate a breathing pattern disorder for an individual? So sometimes I would say is, how would I work with somebody who's coming in with frequent sighing? I would measure their control pause or their bolt score.
Mm-hmm.
If it's less than 25 seconds, and normally it's going to be about 10 seconds, and it could even be less because of that irregular breathing pattern. And when we are breathing irregular and you're feeling that air hunger and your breath hold time is very low, that's going to also put you into that increased stress response because you're not typically having that relaxed and prolonged exhalation. You're having a fast exhalation. And it's the irregular breathing pattern, that information, what's it telling the brain? If we look at studies of exams before doing, say, students before doing exams, the students with the most anxiety had a faster respiratory rate, increased tidal volume, and irregular breathing. So irregular breathing is normal when we're feeling anxious, but somebody who is feeling stressed or somebody who is irregular breathing all the time, I suppose it's a little bit like the communication from the body up to the brain. How we breathe, what are you telling the brain? So Jay, I don't have a full answer. I think it's really interesting. I think that needs a little bit. It would be very interesting to put these questions to Dr. Andy Huberman.
Yeah.
What about somebody who's sighing once every 1 minute,
Mm-hmm.
every 2 minutes, every 3 minutes, every 4 minutes, every 5 minutes? Um, I would probably use breath hold time as an idea that if your breath hold time is very low and you're sighing frequently, it's not ideal. But if you have a decent enough breath hold time, above 25 seconds, and you notice that you're sighing every 7 minutes, that's probably more likely to be normal.
Yeah.
And the individual down with a very low breath hold time, again, because it can be associated with panic disorder and an exaggerated alarm response to the feeling of suffocation or air hunger, going very, very gentle with breathing exercises, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think one of the key concepts that Dr. Huberman tries to convey, or at least how he explains it from a physiological perspective, is that he says that, and I would love to hear kind of your thoughts on this because I'm not sure if I have enough knowledge base to speak intelligently about it. But he says that the key component when you are conscientiously and consciously practicing the physiological sigh as a actual practice is that when you inhale and then you pause and then get that last little bit of air in that he explains it that we are actually helping to expand the alveoli, so these small sacs within the lungs, to get that little bit more oxygenation, and that can help effectively utilize our lungs and to maybe more efficiently kind of utilize oxygen. Now, I'm just kind of interested from your perspective and what you know about the physiology of breathing, the expansion of these so-called alveoli, these little sacs that are in the lungs. What are your thoughts on that from a physiological perspective? So, because that's kind of his take, is that it's that practice can help with that, which then helps with better oxygen delivery, which then therefore helps with decreasing overall stress response.
I think it's going to point down to the frequency of it. Um, and I would be a little bit cautious about people adapting it and frequently sighing because of the long-term impact it can have on their breathing. In terms of alveolar ventilation, if you have a fast respiratory rate, you typically waste more air to dead space. So basically, every breath that we take into our body, the last 150 mil of that air doesn't arrive in the small air sacs. The last 150 mil of air is staying in the nose or the nasal cavity, in the throat, in the trachea, the bronchi, and then the first 16 branches of bronchioles. And if you were breathing fast, so say for example 20 breaths per minute, well, you've just wasted 20 by 150 mil. So you've wasted whatever it is, 3 liters of air in terms of if I have in terms of the waste to dead space. Now, if you take one big breath, one full big breath, you can be taking in 3 liters of air in that one full big breath. So the tidal volume is dramatically increased. Even when you subtract 150, you've got a huge volume of air that's reaching these small air sacs in the lungs. Points that I would make there is, in terms of the human lungs itself, the greatest concentration of blood flow is in the lower lobes. So just be conscious when we are taking in the physiological sigh, where are you ventilating? Are you ventilating primarily the upper chest, or actually are you taking the air down into the lower parts of the lungs? Because that's going to make a difference. So even though you're taking that full breath, are you ventilating here or are you ventilating down here? So number one would be the frequency of it. I think the analogy of the alveolar ventilation, that's correct in terms of reduced dead space. The pause at the end, so you're breathing in, taking a full breath and pausing, is interesting because that pause will allow more oxygen transfer from the lungs into the blood. And, but then again, we have to ask the question, if you want to improve alveolar ventilation, yes, go for a run. And instead of breathing fast and shallow, mouth fast and shallow, breathe nose slow and low. And that will improve your alveolar ventilation. Throughout your day, instead of having the habit of breathing fast and shallow, you're wasting so much air to dead space, you're putting yourself more into that increased stress response. Breathe nose slow and low. So yes, along those lines, it would make sense in what he said in terms of alveolar ventilation.
Yeah. It's sometimes when I hear individuals that I respect, like Andrew Humer, and I absolutely respect him. Sometimes when they say things, about kind of they've kind of perused the literature, they've studied the science, and kind of they've come to the conclusion that whatever practice is like the best evidence based practice. Like I tend to go and still like kind of research it myself. I think as any good scientist would do. He's the one who coined that term physiological sigh as like an actual conscientious practice. And I've looked at the literature to see if there's any studies on the influence of this practice on heart rate variability and autonomic nervous system change. And I haven't come across any. So I would be really interested just to see kind of what that would actually look like. One of the biggest one that continues to come up in the literature would be, slow paced resonance breathing. And I think that, you and I have talked before that it's an absolutely phenomenal practice, but there could be some pitfalls as well, especially if we, just speak to cadence and we don't speak to the other factors of breathing. But that's the one that I think has, we've seen that has the most evidence for autonomic nervous system objective change, so heart rate variability. And there's probably a good reason for it. I mean, Dr. Paul Lair, who sits on the board of Hanu Health, as an advisor. I mean, he's one of the ones who's pioneered these types of studies. And so, once you find something, you're going to really start to study it over and over and over again. So the literature is going to kind of pile up in one direction. And I just understand that's the way it goes. But I hope to see kind of in the future, and maybe Hanu is going to drive some of this as well, just more research in some of these other types of practice to see, okay, how do they affect kind of these objective measures of the autonomic nervous system? Not to say that every single practice it isn't going to be effective if it doesn't move the needle in terms of autonomic nervous system change. But it does have, or at least it shows a good representation from a nervous system perspective of what these practices will do. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that as kind of to your point, Patrick, people shouldn't just go around and like try to sigh all day. Like, I think that it could be potentially beneficial as they kind of sit down, like you practice it as kind of like one of your routine breathwork practices, but saying like, oh man, like every, 5 minutes, I'm just going to start sighing for a while may not necessarily be the best thing. And then again, back to your point, and correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, it's that we do know that there's a natural sigh response that occurs that everybody has, that's not deleterious or detrimental to health. But if we know that there's significant dysfunctional breathing for a certain individual or individuals, that continuous or maybe constant sighing that can occur, that can be deleterious to health, or it is deleterious to health. Am I right in stating that, or is that an overstatement?
Yes, this is just an observation. You know, observing people coming in over the years, especially those coming in with anxiety and predisposition to panic disorder, you really see it. And it's not that everybody with anxiety and panic disorder frequently sigh, but it's very common. And even if you're just around your work colleagues and you start to notice them getting stressed, it's very common that they sigh. So a sigh is associated with either a breathing pattern disorder when somebody is doing it frequently, or if they're feeling uncomfortable. And that's why I always would ask the question then, well, if you deliberately do that, okay, well then you could argue, well then the sigh is bringing relief to that individual. But we also know that chronic hyperventilation can be maintained by occasional sighs. So people with a poor breathing pattern, with a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, every time they have a slight elevation of CO2 in the blood, if their body is reacting by having this big sigh, well then all it's going to do is keep their chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide quite strong. And there is a link here as well in between our chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide and the sensitivity of the baroreflex that you spoke about earlier. It doesn't get talked about so much. It's been in a few papers here and there, not a whole lot. That's an interesting one. And just for those people who are wondering, well, what is chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide? We would have covered it during our chats before, but basically carbon dioxide is the primary stimulus to breathe. And every breath that you take, even during physical exercise, carbon dioxide, the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the blood has a significant influence on your breathing pattern. So you can imagine that as carbon dioxide comes from the tissues into the blood and blood pH drops and the brain is reacting by sending an increased stimulus to breathe. But if we are overly sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, our breathing is that bit faster and harder. So for somebody who has got a low breath hold time, which is an indicator of their chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, whenever they feel or whenever there's a slight accumulation of carbon dioxide in the blood, their body can react quite strongly, and that can manifest as that sigh, but that frequent sighing can keep them stuck in that place. Yeah, this definitely needs more exploration.
Yeah, for sure. This is a great question, though, Kelsey. I really appreciate you submitting this one. I've had a lot of people ask about the role of the physiological sigh, because I think Dr. Huberman has popularized it, which is good. I mean, he's bringing awareness to breathing, but I think too that we don't want to have a misunderstanding of kind of what you're going to experience when you do this. And then also, I think we don't want to have a misunderstanding of some potential downfalls of constantly sighing all day, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. So great question, Kelsey. Awesome.
Jay, I'm just thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful to get Dr. Huberman's insight in this?
I would love it. Yeah. We got the connection. So send it over to him, and let's get him in on it. I love it. Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.